to remember certain things because not the fundamentals of chemistry course, but the organic chemistry course, we are going to need a lot of organic background to follow this course. So you may have to refresh your mind on organic chemistry as well to follow this course. So this is FDT 2202 Basic Biochemistry 2 credit course, and for now it's online lectures, but I prefer doing physical lectures. So once you are here, maybe we can do some we can do in a hybridized manner, both physical and online lectures. So for now, the time is given Thursday 9 to 11. But if it's online lectures, I will do only 1 hour lectures, 10 to 11. But physical lectures we can do from 9 to 11. And I'm also going to use some practical classes. So the remaining hours I'll use for the practical classes as well. So for now, I'll do 10 to 11 lectures, online lectures on Thursday. Okay, so this is the course outline. So we are going to spend 5 weeks discussing carbohydrates, and then 2 weeks for amino acids and proteins, 3 weeks for lipids, then 1 week each for vitamins, minerals, nucleic acids, and in the last 2 weeks we are going to discuss hormones and enzymes. Okay, so this is the major outline. So you can see the carbohydrates is the largest content. So we are going to spend like 5 weeks. So after discussing carbohydrates and this next one, amino acids and proteins. So after spending 7 weeks, we can have our mid-semester exam. You all can hear me, right? Am I clear? Okay. So after these first 7 weeks, we can have the mid-exam, and I think we will be able to do a physical exam. You will be here by 7 weeks, I think. So let's plan that way. And after the mid-exam, we'll cover lipids, vitamins, minerals, nucleic acids, hormones, and enzymes. So this is the assessment procedure. So from the end exam, you will get 60% for the final grade. From the mid-exam, 20%. And then assignments and quizzes 10% each, but this can be very little bit. Sometimes if we don't have time to go for a quiz, I will give you a couple of assignments and take 20% from that for the end exam, for the final grade. So actually, I think you already have the lecture note by now. At the end of this lecture note, you can see the assignment topic. So I have uploaded this note in the LMS. So in the last page, you can see the assignment topic is there. So even now, you can start preparing for this one. So this is a detailed account on carbohydrate metabolism. So you don't have to wait until this 5 weeks are over. You can start looking for this one now. You can start reading about this carbohydrate metabolism now, and then you can prepare a very complete assignment. And this metabolism part is it's an very important part in this biochemistry lecture series. And I'm not going to give any lecture notes for that. So you have to read and write your own notes. So this assignment will be like your note for the end exam. So you will get a couple of questions from metabolism for your final exam, and you have to do self-study on that. Okay, so even now, from now onwards, you can start reading about this one, carbohydrate metabolism. And I need about 10 to 15 pages on this one. So other information are also given. We'll discuss that later. But just keep in mind you have to. So at the end of this carbohydrate, the first 5 weeks, you have to submit this assignment. The first assignment on carbohydrate metabolism. Okay, so maybe you can start preparing for that starting from now. Okay, so that's about the assignment. And then these are the two main references, the Leninger Principles of Biochemistry and Fundamentals of Biochemistry. So maybe you can find this one in our lab, in our library also, but ebooks are also available. So I recommend highly these two books, and if you can't find these two books, any other biochemistry textbook is will be okay for this one. If you want, I mean, if you are doing that assignment, these two references will be highly useful to complete that assignment. Okay, so that's about the course outline, assessment, and references. And now we'll move on to the first section, carbohydrates. So in the first 5 weeks, we are going to discuss carbohydrates. So up to that point, do you have any question? Okay, so then let's move on to carbohydrates. So what are carbohydrates? Any example that you know for carbohydrates? I think you already have the lecture notes with you. So if you go through it, are there any examples that you know for carbohydrates? Okay, in the chat, I got starch, sucrose. You can talk also. What else? So when we say starch and sucrose, so simply we can say sucrose means what? What's the common name for sucrose?
Sugar.
Sugars, right? So for carbohydrates also, sometimes we can commonly say carbohydrates means sugars. Like common name given for carbohydrates is sugars. So carbohydrate, by looking at the term carbohydrate, how do you think the name is formed? It's carbohydrates. It's like two terms.
Carbon and hydrogen.
Carbon and what's the other one?
Hydrogen, madam.
Hydrates. So hydrates means what's the simple term? Hydrate.
Water.
Water. Okay. So it's like carbon and water combined. So carbohydrates actually that's how the name comes. So here you can see carbohydrates. If you look at the formula, empirical formula, it's like carbon and water. C H2O and n number of that unit. So empirical formula, I think you know the word from organic chemistry, this word. So as we discussed, these carbohydrates, They are commonly known as sugars, and these are the most abundant bio-macromolecule on Earth. So, macromolecule means big molecules. Macro means like large macromolecules, and bio-macromolecule. We use the term bio because they are in living living things like animals, plants. So that's why we use this bio. So they are bio macromolecules or not, and carbohydrates is the most abundant one. That's why we are going to spend more time to discuss on carbohydrates, and that's why we are discussing it first because it's the most abundant bio macromolecule on Earth. And commonly they are known as sugars because they have this sweet taste. So if you, for example, glucose, you didn't give that as an example, right? That's the most common carbohydrate, glucose. And then you said sucrose and starch. The sucrose also, they have the sweet taste. And starch, sometimes, I mean, the powder form have kind of sweet taste, but you can say most of them, not all of them, but most of them have the sweet taste. So we can say, so we commonly name them as sugars. And the carbohydrates, the name comes from like these hydrates of carbon. So it's like carbon and water bind together. So many of these carbohydrates have this formula, empirical formula, carbon, water, CH2O, and N times of that. So N can be uh, actually in the smallest N is 3. We'll discuss that later. The smallest number of carbon atoms a carbohydrate is having is 3. So this N is something 3 or bigger than 3. So that's the empirical formula, but some carbohydrates can contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur as well. And then these carbohydrates, they are polyhydroxy aldehydes or ketones. So these terms, again, I think you are familiar from your organic chemistry course. So you know the functional group aldehyde and ketone. So these are not only aldehydes and ketones, but they are polyhydroxyaldehydes or polyhydroxy ketones. Polyhydroxy means hydroxy group means what? What's a hydroxyl group? What are the elements in an hydroxyl group?
Oxygen and hydrogen.
Yeah, OH group, right? Oxygen and hydrogen. So polyhydroxy means there are more than one OH groups, and in the in the structure they have this aldehyde or ketone functional group as well. Not both of them in one molecule, but it can be either aldehyde or ketone with 2 or more hydroxyl groups. So that's why they are known as polyhydroxyaldehydes or polyhydroxy ketones. So when the photosynthesis happen, the light energy from sun, the light energy coming from the sun is converted to chemical energy. So in the plants, this process happen in the plants, you know, the photosynthesis. So light energy is converted into chemical energy, and this chemical energy is stored as carbohydrates, for example, as glucose, fructose, sucrose, or starch, etc. So most commonly, you know, in the photosynthesis, the light energy, the CO2 and H2O, using light energy converted to glucose. So, so light energy is converted to chemical energy, and that energy is stored in a carbohydrate form. So most commonly glucose, and there can be other carbohydrates as well. And then in our body, when we have these carbohydrates as food in our body break down these carbohydrates, and that stored energy is released, and that energy can be used for various activities in the cell, and those activities are known as metabolic activities. So this is the term metabolic. So this is so your first assignment is on this one, how the carbohydrate metabolism take place in our body. So that means how this glucose or whatever the carbohydrate that we eat, how they are converted to energy and utilized for metabolic activities in the cell. So that's what you have to discuss in your first assignment. Okay. Okay, so that's some brief introduction to carbohydrate. So now we'll move on to the classification of carbohydrates. So carbohydrates we can classify into three major groups based on the number of monomer units. So what's a monomer? So I think you are familiar with the term polymer. Polymer means there are a large number of common repeating unit in a polymer, right? So that repeating unit in a polymer is known as a monomer unit. So depending on this monomer unit, carbohydrates can be divided into three major groups. So if you go through the lecture notes, what are the three groups? What are the three major categories of carbohydrates?
Monosaccharides, oligosaccharides, polysaccharides.
Okay. Thank you. And I think most of you haven't gone through the lecture notes. That's really good. So we have monosaccharides, oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides. So monosaccharides means we have one monomer unit. Like, for example, the most abundant monosaccharide is glucose. And we'll see the structure later. So, and oligosaccharide means they are small chains of monomer units. So ideally about 2 to 20 monomer units joined together to give us oligosaccharides. So if it is two monomer units, there's a common name that we use for that. So what is the carbohydrate with two monomer units? So if it has one monomer unit, it's known as a monosaccharide. If it has two monomer units,
Disaccharide.
disaccharide. Okay. So if it has three, it can be trisaccharide. So likewise. So most abundant oligosaccharide is the one with two monomer units. That means disaccharide. And can you give an example for disaccharide?
Sucrose.
Yeah, sucrose is like. Thank you so much. So sucrose is like one of the most abundant disaccharide. And what are the two monomer units found in sucrose?
Glucose and fructose.
Glucose and fructose, right? Okay, so you are familiar with these things, right? I think maybe from your A levels. Okay, so that's oligosaccharide. And then polysaccharide means, so of course, more than 20 monomer units, or it can be hundreds or thousands monomer units. Can you give some examples for polysaccharides? Yes.
Starch,
Starch. What else?
glycogen,
Glycogen. Okay. So in all those that you said, cellulose, starch, and glycogen, in all those three polysaccharides, what's the monomer?
Glucose.
Glucose, right? So it's the same monomer but different polysaccharides. So that means the change is how these glucose units are arranged. There can be like linear chains of glucose or maybe branched chains. So their linkage is the one that is changing from one polysaccharide to another. So we are going to look at those details we are going to draw those structures later and look at the bonding between monomer units. Okay, so let's go through the lecture note. So we can classify, we can divide carbohydrates into three major groups: monosaccharides, oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides. Monosaccharides, they have single polyhydroxyaldehyde or ketone unit. So polyhydroxy means more than one hydroxyl group. So for example, the simplest one is the one with 3 carbon atoms. So like here, you can see, so 3 carbon atoms. This one has an aldehyde group and 2 OH groups. So this is the smallest 3 carbon sugar with aldehyde group. And here, this one, this molecule has a ketone group, carbonyl group in the middle of the chain. So, and 2 OH groups, and this is a ketone group. So this is the smallest 3 carbon sugar with a ketone group. So we'll give different names for these molecules later. So that's the smallest monosaccharide possible. So the smallest monosaccharide has 3 carbon atoms. And the most abundant monosaccharide in nature is the 6 carbon sugar glucose. So I think you are familiar with the glucose structure. It has 6 carbon atoms, and that is the most abundant monosaccharide. So in later, I mean maybe next week or week after, you will understand why glucose is the most abundant monosaccharide. What's the chemical explanation behind that, why it is most abundant. So for now, you can think about that, why glucose is the most abundant one. Why not something else? Why not 4 carbon atom sugar? There are 5 carbon atom sugars, 3 carbon atom, 7 carbon atoms, but the 6 carbon glucose is the most abundant one. So you have to find out the reason for that. Okay, so maybe next week I'm going to ask it. So just check why this 6 carbon sugar glucose is the most abundant one. There should be a reason for that. So you can just check that one, why glucose is the most abundant monosaccharide in nature. Okay, and then monosaccharides with more than 4 carbon atoms tend to have cyclic structures. Now this one, the one that we saw, these 3 carbon atom sugars, they have this linear form, right? This open chain forms. So the 3 carbon atoms are in a linear manner. Here also like that. So this is known as the carbon atom backbone. So this backbone is in a linear chain, not a cyclic structure. But when the number of carbon atoms is increased, when it is 4 or more than 4, not actually 4, when it's more than 4, that means when you have carbon carbon and atoms like 5, 6, 7, like that, then they tend to form cyclic structures. And maybe next week we will look at how those cyclic structures are formed from the linear structure. So for now, just remember, when the monosaccharide has more than 4 carbon atoms, they form cyclic structures. Okay, so that's about monosaccharides, and later we are going to discuss these things in details. And then oligosaccharides. So these are short chain of monosaccharide units joined through a characteristic linkage called glycosidic bond. So the bond between two monosaccharide units is known as a glycosidic bond, and we'll look at the structure of this bond later. For now, just remember the term glycosidic bond. So from the oligosaccharide, the most abundant oligosaccharide is the disaccharide. So with 2 monosaccharide units, as we discussed earlier. So there are 2 monosaccharide units joined through 1 glycosidic bonds, that is known as a disaccharide. So as you gave the example earlier, so typically sucrose. Sucrose, it contains glucose and fructose joined through a disaccharide bond. So in oligosaccharides, the number of monomer units can be range from 2 to 20. So there can be 2 monosaccharides to 20 monosaccharides in an oligosaccharide. And then polysaccharides. So these are the carbohydrates containing more than 20 monomers, more than 20 monosaccharide units, or we can say 20 monomers. And some polysaccharides may have hundreds or thousands of units. So polysaccharides like cellulose, we are going to see the structure later. So these cellulose are linear chain. Glucose molecules are joined in a linear manner in cellulose molecule. And another example for polysaccharide is glycogen. In glycogen, again the monomer is glucose, and glucose molecules are joined in a branched manner in glycogen. So in both cellulose and glycogen, the monomer or the monosaccharide is glucose, but their glycosidic bond is different. Therefore, they can be either linear structures or branched structures. The structure is different, even though they have the same monomer unit. Okay, so that's about polysaccharides. Okay, now, so those are the three major categories of carbohydrates. So any questions up to that point? Okay, now we'll move on to discuss monosaccharides in more detail. So monosaccharides, as we discussed earlier, this is the simplest of carbohydrates. And these monosaccharides are either aldehydes or ketones. We already know that they can have aldehyde functional group or ketone functional group with 2 or more hydroxyl groups. So you can see this is the simplest one. This one has one aldehyde group, 2 hydroxyl groups attached to. So there's a carbon atom backbone formed from carbon atoms and hydroxyl groups, and this aldehyde carbonyl attached to that. And here also you have 2 hydroxyl groups and 1 carbonyl group. So these are the simplest monosaccharides. So this is the simplest monosaccharide which has an aldehyde group. This one, simplest monosaccharide which has a ketone group. And these monosaccharide, these are colorless. Now, when you look at glucose, the solid form is actually not colorless, right? You can see some whitish color there, but actually, if you dissolve them, they don't have that white color. They become colorless. So the usually monosaccharides are colorless and they are crystalline solids. So they have a definite structure. That's why it's called crystalline. They are not just a crude powder, but each of these not crystal, glucose molecule, they have a definite structure. That's why we call it a crystalline solid. And we'll look at the structure later. And they are colorless crystalline solids and freely soluble in water. Why glucose molecule, not let's say glucose, because that's the most common one. So why glucose is soluble in water? Can you think of that? So this is the structure of glucose. It has 6 carbon atoms, 5 hydroxyl groups and an aldehyde group. So why do you think it's soluble in water? What's the chemical nature? Anything that you learned from the organic chemistry course? You have to think about the functional groups present. So what are the functional groups in this molecule glucose? You have aldehyde group and hydroxyl groups. So why it's soluble in water? Someone says linear structure එකක් නිසා, but actually glucose, even though we draw it as a linear structure, maybe next week we'll see that it's actually not a linear structure. It's in an aqueous medium. In water, this glucose exists as in a cyclic manner. It's actually a cyclic molecule. Even though we draw it like this way, it forms a cyclic structure. So we'll look at that structure hopefully next week. So linear structure එකක් නිසා වතුර දිය වෙනවා කියන්න බෑ. So what's the reason for this soluble in water? Did you discuss anything about polarity in organic chemistry course?
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, actually your connection was poor. Okay, so I got one answer. It has polar hydroxyl groups. Yeah, that's like the basic reason for that one. It has these hydroxyl groups, polar, and this aldehyde group, this carbonyl group is also polar. So they can form hydrogen bonds with water molecules. So that's why it's soluble in water. Okay, so they are colorless crystalline solids that are freely soluble in water but insoluble in non-polar solvents. So because these molecules are polar molecules, they have OH and carbonyl groups, so they are polar molecules. Therefore, they are soluble only in polar solvents. So and insoluble in non-polar solvents. So if you have a solvent like hexane or benzene, then if you add glucose, it will not dissolve in those non-polar solvents. Okay, and then most of the monosaccharides has a sweet taste, like glucose and fructose. They have a sweet taste. And then the backbone of monosaccharide molecules are unbranched carbon chains in which all the carbon atoms are linked by single bonds. For example, here you can see this carbon atom backbone. They are linear chain. You can see it as a chain and each carbon atom joined through single bonds. There are no double or triple bonds between carbon atoms. Here also like that. You have carbon atom backbone, each carbon atom joined through single bonds. If you look at the glucose structure, there also you can see carbon atom backbone. These carbon atoms joined through single bonds. And in fructose also, you can see the same, similar thing. So that means they have the backbone, they are unbranched. Unbranched means there are no, the carbon atoms are not connected to another carbon atom in these branch points. So they are connected only to hydrogen or OH. There are no carbon atoms in the branched points. See, so it's, we consider it as a unbranched chain, carbon chain. So the backbone, it's unbranched carbon chain and all the carbon atoms are linked by single bonds. So that's about the structure of monosaccharides. Then in the open chain form, that means not the cyclic one, that is this linear form. This is known as the open chain form because as I mentioned earlier, in aqueous medium, these molecules tend to form cyclic structures. But now we are discussing about this linear form, this open chain form. So in the open chain form, you can see there's a carbonyl group, and this carbonyl group can be at the end of the molecule or it can be at the middle of the molecule. So if the carbonyl group is at the end, then carbonyl group is in an aldehyde group. So those kind of sugars are known as aldoses. So when you have aldehyde functional group in the sugar, in the monosaccharide, then they are known as aldoses. And when you have the carbonyl group in the middle of the chain, that means you have the carbonyl functional group, not carbonyl, the ketone functional group, then they are known as a ketose. So you have monosaccharides. Depending on the functional group of the monosaccharide, we can divide them into two categories, aldoses and ketoses. Okay, so in the open chain form, one of the carbon atoms is double bonded to oxygen atom. That means there's a carbonyl group. So this carbonyl group, so one carbon atom is joined to the carbonyl double bond oxygen, joined to an oxygen through a double bond, which means there's a carbonyl group. And the other carbon atoms are joined to hydroxyl groups. You can see here, there's one carbonyl group and all the other carbon atoms has a hydroxyl group. Here also like that, carbonyl group and other carbon atoms has a hydroxyl group. Okay, each of the other carbon atoms has a hydroxyl group. The two families of monosaccharides are aldoses and ketoses. So aldoses means if the carbonyl group is at the end of the carbon chain, like this, carbonyl group is at the end. So that means in an aldehyde group, then the monosaccharide is known as an aldose. Then ketoses means if the carbonyl group is at any other position, that means not in the not at the end of the carbon chain, but in the middle of the chain. So if it's in the middle, then that means in a ketone group, then the monosaccharide is known as a ketose. So these two are the simplest monosaccharide. The simplest monosaccharides has three carbon atoms. The simplest one has three carbon atoms. So this one has an aldehyde group and two OH group. So it's known as a aldose. And as it has three carbon atoms, we called it as a triose as well. Triose means tri is to indicate three carbon atoms. So what if there are four carbon atoms? What would be the name?
Pentose.
Four carbon atoms. Penta is for five.
Tetra.
Tetrose, right? So when the monosaccharide has three carbon atom, we can call it as a triose. And when it has four carbon atoms, it is a tetrose. Five carbon atoms, pentose. Six carbon atoms, hexose. I think you are familiar with the term hexose because glucose is a hexose. And then if it is seven, heptose. Likewise, it can be vary. So monosaccharide with 4, 5, 6, 7 carbon atoms, they can be called as tetrose, pentose, hexose, heptose, respectively. So here, the simplest one has three carbon atoms, therefore they are known as trioses. And remember earlier we gave another term, aldoses and ketoses. Now we can combine these two words. So here, if the molecule has three carbon atom, it's a triose. And as it has an aldehyde group, we call it as an aldotriose. It has an aldehyde group and as it is three carbon, we call it a triose. It's aldotriose. And this one has three carbon atoms, so it's a triose, but it has a ketone group. So we call it a ketotriose. So you can name them like that way, aldotriose and ketotriose. Similarly here in glucose, so it's a, what's the name we can given like that way for glucose? It has an aldehyde group, so you have the term aldo, and it has six carbon atoms. So it's a
Hexose.
yes, aldohexose. So for glucose, we can say it's an aldohexose. So when you say aldohexose, it that means it has an aldehyde group and 6 carbon atoms in the backbone. So it can be glucose or any other uh, aldohexose. When we say aldohexose, yeah, it's glucose. Uh, for fructose, it has a ketone group, so it's a ketohexose. But if you look at ketohexoses, it's not only fructose. There can be other ketohexoses as well, because this carbonyl group in the fructose, the carbonyl group is at the second carbon atom. But this carbonyl group can be in the third carbon atom also. Let's see. Maybe we have that structure here. So carbonyl group, do I have it? Maybe I don't have it. But that carbonyl group position can be changed. So if the carbonyl group is at the, let's say at the third carbon atom, somewhere here, but still it's a ketohexose because still it's a ketone group and 6 carbon atom. So this is a ketohexose, but fructose is not the only ketohexose. There can be more. Okay. You can go through the lecture note again, just read them again, otherwise you will not understand. Okay, so there are a lot of new terms here. You have to remember those things. So that's why actually I am going to do only 1 hour. Because if it's 2 hours, there will be a lot for you to digest. So I'll I'd like to go a little bit slowly here. Okay, so trioses, again, trioses means in the carbon atom backbone, you have 3 carbon atoms, and it can be aldotriose, carbon atom, 3 carbon atom and an aldehyde group, or ketotriose, 3 carbon atom and a ketone group. And then, depending on the number of carbon atoms, different names can be given: tetrose, pentose, hexose, heptose, like that. And from hexoses, this glucose, fructose, they are the most abundant monosaccharides in nature. And we later we'll see why they are most abundant. And earlier I asked you to find out why glucose is the most abundant hexose. And now we can say most abundant aldohexose. So why glucose is the most abundant aldohexose in nature? We have to find out that one. Okay, so the next one is asymmetric centers of monosaccharides, but that's completely new information for you. So I am not going to start that one today. So from the things that we discussed so far, are there any questions? So next week, before you come to the class, please go through this part, asymmetric centers of monosaccharides. I think, did you all enroll for the class? There should be around 80 to 85 students because both bioprocess and food both are doing this course. So did you enroll for the course? All of you? I'll check in the LMS. If not, please enroll and download these lecture notes. And before you come to the class next week, please go through this page number 3, 4, 5 maybe. Then it will be easy for me to explain the things because you are a little bit familiar with the terms. If you at least go through once. Otherwise, it will be difficult for you to follow because I like to use the blackboard or whiteboard to discuss these things. So when you are here physically, we'll be able to discuss these things properly. So one student is saying the LM is not working. Is it correct? So any one of you didn't enroll for the course?
Yes.
Is it working or not?
Recording
Is it
stopped.
working? Anyone enroll for the course? Who is the rep here? Ajit. LMS එක වැඩ කරනවද? අද වැඩ කරනවා. enroll වෙච්ච students ලා ඉන්නවද කී දෙනෙක් කවුරු හරි? Are there anyone who enrolled for the course in LMS?
ඔව් මැඩම් එන්රෝල් වුණා.
ඔව් මැඩම් අපි එන්න.
ඒ කියන්නේ අනිත් අයටත් පුළුවන් වෙයි. Just try it and try to download the lecture notes. Then before you come to the class, you can go through it little bit. Okay, and as a homework, find out why glucose is the most abundant aldohexose in nature. So that's the homework. Are there any question for me from your side?
Excuse me, madam.
Oh,
Can you repeat again, madam, with homework about?
find out why glucose is the most abundant aldohexose in nature. So glucose, we said earlier, glucose is the most abundant aldohexose in nature, and you have to find out the reason for that, why it is the most abundant. It can be any other aldohexose, but only glucose is the most abundant, not other hexoses. So we have to find out the reason for that. Just read a little bit why glucose is the most abundant hexose, or maybe why it is the most abundant monosaccharide in nature. If you look at the all the monosaccharides that we discussed, it can be 3 carbon atom, 4, 5, 6, 7 carbon atoms, but glucose is the most abundant one in all those monosaccharides. So we have to find out the reason for that. Okay. So, okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate that you guys participated in the discussion, because some of, from my experience, some of your seniors, they don't talk at all. So I really appreciate and keep it up, okay? Not only in this lecture, in other lectures also, just participate and discuss with the lecturer. That's very good. And that's really important. Otherwise, it will be boring for me also. Just talking and talking, and I can't see you as well, because as it's online lectures, it's really important if I get some feedback from you as well. Okay, then I think the things that we discussed today is clear for you. So we'll meet again next week at 10 a.m. Okay, and if it is physical lectures, we'll maybe start around 9:30. I'll let you know. But for now, if it's online lectures, we'll do it at 10 to 11. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, madam.
Thank Thank you, you. madam.
Thank you, madam.